But Ezekiel, major prophet, and as far as reading the prophets, he's probably the more exciting ones, just because it seems to be like crazy stuff keeps happening as he keeps going. Isaiah is, you kind of have to look around to find where he is doing things, like when he has to walk naked for 3 years, but Ezekiel starts out getting weird stuff told to him. Like in the first 4 chapters is kind of his calling. I didn't parse that out, but that's kind of like his calling to the ministry. And he starts seeing visions right off the bat. Like God gives him these crazy visions of wheels and beasts and different wheels that have eyes on the spokes or the rim. And then God tells him to do some crazy stuff. Chapter 4, he tells him, all right, I want you to lay down on your left side for 390 days. So he never moves. Just remains laying down on his left side for 390 days. Just has food brought to him. And then he goes on and lays on his right side for 40 days, just to be an illustration. And then in chapter 4, God tells him to cook bread over a fire that the only fuel is human dung. And he tells him to eat that bread, and it's all to illustrate Israel's sin towards God, rebellion against God, the folly of what they do. Like why would you try to ingest something that's excrement or like associated with excrement, made by excrement? And then in chapter 12, he tells them, just as an illustration, get your bag like you're ready to leave town and dig your way through the wall, but don't go anywhere. Just to show Israel, this is what's going to happen when you go. And so he has to just get the bag and go and dig by hand through the wall. And he's a prophet of the exile. So remember we saw Jeremiah kind of ushering the people up to and then through a little bit of the exile of the Babylonians come and yanking them out of the land finally. Ezekiel we only know him outside of the land. We only know him living in Babylon. So he's a former priest, or he's from a family of priests, rather. So if he's 30 right now, which is what verse 1:1 leads you to believe, it says in the 30th year, well, whose 30th year? There's no king, and there's no, you're not in the temple anymore, or Jerusalem. So if he's 30, then that means he never got to actually function as a priest in the temple, because they couldn't get in the temple and do anything until they were 30 years old. So he was of the priestly family and knew everything about it, but he never actually got to do it, because now there's no temple. It got blown to bits, and then now he's gone. So, but he's a priest who ends up getting called to this prophetic ministry. So Ezekiel's an exciting guy. I'm going to read this book. And you know what? A funny fact that I read, that some Jewish rabbis, and who knows how extensive or widely practiced this was, because Ezekiel is so crazy, the book itself, and so kind of fantastic, Jewish rabbis wouldn't let young men read it until they were 30. Just because it was 30 is a Jewish age of typically of like you finally a trustworthy adult. Like 13, we're going to treat you like a man, but 30 will let you actually do stuff and listen to you. And so they didn't let them read Ezekiel because it's crazy stuff. Now we have Revelation, and so we if we want to read crazy stuff, that's where we go to read that. But this is essentially like the Hebrew Bible Revelation, just crazy weird stuff. Heavens, bring out the big guns.
I think that one's not going to last the whole time.
Way to go. So anyways, they wouldn't let him read it because it was just too weird. Kind of like when your 11-year-old says, "I want to study Revelation with you, Dad," and you're like, "Oh, why don't we stick with Mark or Galatians or something?" Because you're like, it's going to be weird, and it's kind of weird to me too, and it's hard for me to understand. So Ezekiel's kind of like that because there's visions that don't get elaborated on. Like Ezekiel doesn't get told, "Hey, the wheel is exactly this, and the eyes on the wheel's rim are this, and the wheel that sees everything that's constantly turning is this." We're just kind of like having to come to those conclusions ourselves, kind of like what we do a lot of times with Revelation, like where it doesn't explain what this beast is or what that situation is. We just kind of have to come to our conclusions based on the whole of the Bible, like what could this be talking about? So Ezekiel has crazy stuff in it. The 3 visions we're going to look at, that's going to be kind of a helpful structure for us. This is just an overall literary structure, kind of like the prophets tend to be, like we've seen. My people, you're going to get judged. Everybody else, by the way, you're also going to get judged. But then restoration. So the theme, like Jeremiah is big on restoration. Ezekiel's also that. And we're going to see a parallel text to Jeremiah 31. So the tent poles, Jeremiah 31, 33 through 34. Ezekiel 36 is going to be a straight up parallel to that passage as well. Also, before we run into this book, look for these themes. This is something just for personal reading. The theme of creation, decreation, and recreation. Maybe not theme, but format. Or you can call it creation, fall, redemption, exists in the book of Ezekiel. Like God created, man's sin, in a sense, decreates, like ruins everything. But then God's going to recreate. That's kind of what the last section, 40 through 48, the last vision is the recreation. So, but we see that through all of Scripture, right? Genesis, we see creation. Genesis 3, through the rest of most of it, is man's decreation, the fall, the outworkings of sin. But then redemption comes with Jesus, and then finally fulfilled with Jesus in Revelation. So that's kind of a structure for the whole Bible, helpful structure for Ezekiel. When you get lost in the weeds of what's going on, you can kind of know, like, lay down these tracks for you to kind of follow as you study. So these 3 visions is going to be kind of how we structure our time, because they in a sense, they kind of follow this, but they kind of give the main points of what God's trying to come across, get across through Ezekiel to his people. So the visions are, and I didn't write them down, which is probably okay because what I wrote down yesterday got erased. This vision is God as King, vision number 1. Vision number 2 is God's departure. This is not my best use of board space, as you can tell. I have this section that kind of bleeds over there, and so you can be patient.
Blame it on the people that erased it.
Right. They did this. God, and then the vision 4 is God's coming. He comes back, and then promise of paradise is what the last vision is. Again, not well laid out board, but doing the best I can, sir. So we're going to look through the visions. The first one, the vision of God as King, which is chapters 1 through 3. We're going to see in this that the people had put, in Ezekiel's day, or right before Ezekiel's day, so right before they get exiled out, God's kind of addressing this issue with them that they had put so much faith and trust in the things that they had. They had the temple. They had the Davidic line of kings. They had the presence of God in the temple. They were in the promised land. And so they were trusting those things and not God. So they're like, well, we have these things now, so then therefore we can do whatever we want. We're set up for life here. And so it doesn't really matter what we do. Instead of trusting God himself, it was the blessings of God that they were trusting. And they had misused them. And so what God's going to do is pull them out of the land for 70 years. And he's going to say, we don't have time to dive into this theme in Ezekiel, but the Sabbath is a big deal in Ezekiel as well. And for every year of Jubilee, or not year of Jubilee, every Sabbath year they were in the land, not Sabbath day, which is the 7th day of the week, but there's supposed to be a Sabbath year every 7 years. That 7th year, you don't plant crops like you did before. You just let the land do what it's going to do and trust God to provide for you for that whole year. And they didn't do it one time. Since being in the promised land, they did not do that one time. So they missed 70 of those. So God adds up all those 70 years, and my land will get its rest. So he pulls them out for 70 years. So as he's pulling them out, this is the vision that's going to come in chapters 1 through 3, that God's going to still go with them. That's what's insane. You're out of the land. You don't have a temple. You don't have a Davidic king right now. But God's still going to be with you. So we're going to read kind of along those lines. Let's look at verse 1:1. And then somebody get ready to read 1:4-6. I'll read 1:1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, that's a portion of the river in Babylon, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Somebody read 4-6.
As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings.
So, and it kind of just goes from there with these bizarre creatures. Do you feel like Revelation yet? Chapter 1 already? Somebody read 15-19 now.
Now as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. And the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went. And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose.
So again, it's going pretty crazy. Bizarre creatures. Maybe they're surrounding God's throne, but we haven't seen a throne yet until verse 25 through the end of the chapter. Somebody read that.
And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And above the expanse over their heads, there was the likeness of a throne, an appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking.
So with this crazy intro vision, this is chapter 1. You start out with this. We need to make a few observations just based on this, because we know from verse 28 what it says is that this is the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So we know all these wheels within wheels that move but don't turn, and the beasts and these crazy bizarre animals, or creatures rather, I don't even know if animals is the right word for it, that this is, according to Ezekiel, the likeness of the glory of God. So in understanding that, there's a few observations that we can take. One of them, the first one, is that God is not like us. And when you look at these things, like what Ezekiel, like in this vision, it just looks different than we are. He says it looks like human likeness, but he doesn't say it was a human sitting on that throne. And then all of the stuff that kind of goes around God's throne with the wheels and the creatures and all that this is just not like us. It's likeness, similar. He's kind of describing in reverse what God said how he was going to make humans, right? Let's make them in our image. So we bear the likeness of God. That Jesus came in the likeness of sinful man, but not exactly. And we're not like God in that God's mostly like us. God is God, and we're we're in his image, but he's not like us. He's other than us. And Ezekiel's pretty aware of that after having this crazy vision. And he's saying words like, as it were, appearance, likeness. He's not saying like, it definitely was. This is exactly what this thing was. He's just trying to describe it as best he can. Kind of like John in the Apocalypse, in Revelation. So Ezekiel's floored, and because God is holy. What?
These visions, do we think that it was like a dream that they saw in their sleep? Do we think that it's something that they saw out in pure sight? Is there any background on any of that?
So I think, particularly for Ezekiel, like I'm not going to lump all visions in together. Obviously, God does use dreams, right? The most famous ones are Joseph's dreams, and then Joseph in the New Testament dreams when Gabriel comes and talks to him. So we know that he does that. But he keeps describing the location that he's in. He's like, I'm next to the Chebar Canal. Like I'm by the river, what canal over the river, and then I see these things. So is it it's kind of like Daniel chapter 7 and following. He's like, I'm out, outside, and then the angel Gabriel comes and starts showing me this crazy stuff. And so I think he's really seeing something, particularly because of chapter 37. When we get to that, that's the Valley of the Dry Bones scene, where he's not asleep. It's like God takes him to a place, shows him this thing, and then it all happens. All these dead bones, and they all come alive. And he was like, what? So if other people are around, are they seeing it? I don't know. If anybody else isn't even around. But that's a good question because they are pretty fantastical. So then the second observation, so first one, God's not like us. Second one, God is all-powerful and wise. All-powerful. How do we get that? We see that in verse 18. Because this is the vision of the glory of God. The rims were tall and awesome. Awesome, not like the way we say it, which just means I like that thing, kind of. Awesome meaning like worthy of awe. Like summarized by awe. Awesome. And the rims of all four were full of eyes all around. God can see everything. And the four faces that look in every direction. Verse 6, each had four faces. And then verse 10, and the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. And then it goes there, like the right side was a lion, and then an ox, and then an eagle. But then verse 17, they went in every direction. God looking in every direction. Omniscience. He sees everything. He knows everything. He's all-knowing, all-powerful, and that Ezekiel can trust him because then a voice speaks at the end of the passage. God's also not limited by circumstances. We can see that from chapter 1 because this is an amazing God-wrought vision, and it's not happening in Jerusalem. It's not happening where the temple is. It's not happening with a Davidic king. They're in Babylon. They're nowhere that the Old Testament has as significant. They're in the homeland of the bad guys, subservient to the bad guys. God doesn't have to do things based by just the temple or just by these other things. He's not constricted to that. He can be where his people are even when they're scattered. And he has a concern for the whole world based on verse 28. Somebody read the first half of verse 28 again. We already read it, but let's read it again.
Like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so is the appearance of the brightness all around.
What's the significance of the bow after rain? Promise to never flood the whole world, right? Yeah, the world. So this is God saying, like, I'm everywhere in the world. I have a concern for the world. I mean, this is a sidetrack, but it's worth our time. When we start to try to say, or when people start to say, and they're out there, and they are churches that you would maybe think about going to even, that it doesn't matter whether the flood in Genesis 6 through 9 was a whole global flood. It could just be that he flooded that region right there. Because Eretz in Hebrew can mean land or space or world, and so we don't need to make and insist that it's a global flood. But throughout the Bible, the meaning of Genesis 6 unfolds if it's not a global flood. It's right here. Right. If God is not a global flood, then verse 28, we don't get to say God's concern for the whole world. Even though he's talking to his people and to the nations. Both going to get judged for rejecting me. That That's what God said. I'm not going to flood the whole world again, but I am going to judge the whole world at some point. So if judgment's coming for the whole world, and God's refraining from flooding the whole world, then he has a concern for the whole world. That's why John 3:16 matters. God to love the whole world, in the sense that every single people group on the planet, not just one particular skin tone or ethnicity. So the whole world is what God is concerned for, and he's not bound to anything. The last, or not the last one, but second to last observation to make is God taking the initiative, that God is the one who comes to us. Ezekiel is just hanging out by the river, having a pretty miserable life because his whole career is shot to ribbons. He's supposed to be a priest. He has no other skills, spent 29 years trying to be a priest, and that gets blown up, and now he's in exile as a 30-year-old. What is he going to do? And he's there, and then who speaks first? Chapter 1, verse 1. The heavens were opened. Ezekiel didn't open the heavens. God opened the heavens and showed him these visions. And then verse 3 it says, the word of the Lord came. God initiated. Verse 4, I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north. So this vision is coming to him. He didn't provoke it or bring it about. Verse 25, there came a voice above the expanse. Verse 28, the last sentence, and I heard the voice of one speaking. It's like Moses with the burning bush, Isaiah in chapter 6 when he sees the vision of God's temple. God initiates with us. God moves toward us. God speaks first. God moves towards us first. Paul on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. None of those men, Moses, Isaiah, Paul, were looking for God. God came to them and spoke to them. That God initiates, and that's true for all of us. None of us are out looking for God. God comes to us through people, but comes to us. And then he communicates. God communicates. What is the climax of the vision? It kind of begins in verse 25 and finishes in verse 28. It's somebody speaking. I heard a voice over the expanse. I heard the voice of one speaking. That all these visions are swirling around with this insane craziness that's hard for us to understand. And then the big crescendo is words. Words. And if we were writing this script, wouldn't we flip that? Ezekiel's out by the river hanging out, and then he hears words, and then suddenly all these visions, and they get bigger and bigger and grander and grander. That's the opposite of how God works. And what does he call Jesus, his own son? The Word. The Word became flesh. The climax is the Word. That God's speaking words. Jesus didn't come as the image. He didn't come as the picture. He didn't come as the video. He came as the Word. So when God speaks, you can take a lot of drugs and see some crazy stuff. But God's not going to speak to you. And Ezekiel gets spoken to directly by God. That's why in our church, the gatherings that we do are word-centered. Because that's God's crescendo. I'm going to speak to my people. Here are real words. God's committed to doing that. Second vision. We've got to keep on rolling. So this is God's departure. So this is just kind of God's presence. God is king. God is sovereign. God is holy. God is other. Ezekiel, know who I am. That's the first vision. Second vision, the story starts unfolding. He tells Ezekiel to do some stuff. There's some great passages that we're skipping over in chapters 1 through 7 before we get to 8, where he's telling Ezekiel, go be a watchman on the wall. I mean, it's great. I've used it before as a devotional. Whenever I do a wedding, I go to the groom and get his groomsmen around and try to have a devotional. I've used this before as like, are you going to go be a watchman and stand in the breach of the wall? Because where's the fighting going to happen? Wherever there's a hole in the wall. And are you going to go stand there? Or are you going to go stand where there's no fighting? So that's what God tells Ezekiel to do. And he tells them they're not going to listen to you. I'm sending you to them. They are not going to listen. But their blood is on your hands if you don't tell them. Their blood is on their hands if you do tell them. So that we have to skip all over all that because we got to follow these visions and we're limited on time and there's 48 chapters in this book. But chapter 8, second vision comes. And this is God's departure from the temple. So this is a big judgment section. So departure from the temple is specific judgment to Jerusalem, meaning Judea, the last of the Jewish people that are still in the land, and God's departure from the temple. But it's kind of a flashback, because God left the people long ago in a sense that they rejected him. But Ezekiel's going to get to kind of see this dramatized, played out. And this vision kind of reminds us that true paradise won't be found on this earth. This is not true paradise. And certainly the people, the Israelites would know that. They're like, yeah, we're not, this isn't great. This is miserable. We don't have the temple. We don't have, we don't have the land. We don't have a Davidic king. But Jerusalem is what Ezekiel's going to tell them. Jerusalem wasn't paradise. We're not trying to get back to Old Testament sacrifices. We're trying to go to a better land, a promised land, the capital P promised land. So they were thinking about, like, we're going to protect Jerusalem, we got to protect the Davidic king, we got to have the temple. No matter what all these things, we got to have those things, but they weren't holding on to God, and that was wrong. So chapter 6 through 24, which the visions lumped into that, God wants them to know exactly why they're being judged. That's just good parenting, right? If you're going to spank your kid, this is exactly why this is happening. You did this. Here are the list of your offenses. This is why you're being punished. Not because I'm rash, not because I'm having a bad day, but because you have done these things. So he's going to lay it out to them in chapter 6 through 24. And these prophecies begin in chapter 6. Chapter 7, verse 22 says that God says, I will turn my face from them. The Jewish prayer of blessing is, may God's face shine upon you. May his face be ever toward you. And then the reverse of that is happening now. I'm going to turn my face away from them. Jeremiah said the same thing in Jeremiah 18:17. I will show them my back. I will not show them my face. But the core of God's complaint for his people is in 8 through 11. That God is, he's going to give Ezekiel a very specific vision of the idolatry that was being practiced in the temple. And then 10 through 11, the vision continues, and he sees God departing from the temple. And then chapter 11, he physically is going to watch God walk out of the temple and then out of the city in this vision. So let's look at it. Chapter 8. Somebody read 1 through 3.
In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire. And from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood.
So he takes him physically. He says he grabs him by the hair, and he's going to pull him. I want you to come see this. I feel like it's almost like a football coach just grabbing your face mask, not in an angry way, but just grab your face. I'm like, just come here. I'm going to show you this. And he goes and shows him exactly where the idol is in the temple. Shows them exactly where their sin is. So somebody read chapter 8, 9 through 10.
He said to me, go in and see the wicked abominations that they are committing here. So I entered and looked, and behold, every form of creeping things and beasts and detestable things, with all the idols of the house of Israel, were carved on the wall all around.
So carved on the wall. So whether or not this is, so he's going back in time, whether or not this is exactly what the temple looks like at that time, because Ezekiel wouldn't have known. He wasn't allowed to get to do and see these things because he wasn't a full priest by the time he got yanked out. Even if it's just symbolic, it could be exactly real. They could have engraved these idols on the wall. But even if it's not, like, this is just symbolic of, like, in the house of my worship that I gave specific instructions. There's not one iota of unclarity on what the temple is supposed to look like. So the second half of Exodus all is, right? So we quit, and we jump over that to Leviticus, and we realize that's not any better, and we quit reading altogether. We read our Bibles from Genesis through Exodus about 24. But that's what the second half of the book is about. Do not change any of this. It's down to the iota. This is exactly how the tabernacle is supposed to be. And then you take that and you expand it into what the temple is supposed to be when it's permanent. And they come and they completely pervert it. They're not going like, well, we thought that this is what kind of we could do. I thought we had a little bit of room to move for expressing our worship to God. There was no room. There's dot for dot, line for line, nail for nail, what the temple is supposed to look like. And God takes them in and goes, see, look, this is exactly what I said was going on. I'm not making this up. Obviously, this has to be a flashback because the temple's already destroyed. So this is a deep level vision. But then let's go to chapter 11 and verse 22 through 24. Somebody read those to kind of help us bring this vision to a close.
Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in the vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea, to the exiles. Then the vision that I had seen went up from me, and I told the exiles all the things that the Lord had shown me.
So God leaves. The vision that he sees is God leaving Jerusalem. He's gone. And man is culpable for it. We talk about God's sovereignty all the time, and rightly so, but God is saying right here that you are responsible. And he expands even further. Chapter 16. Somebody pick up chapter 16, verses 15 through 19. So, because it's going to be explicit, God saying, this is your fault.
But you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of the work of your renown and lavished your whorings on any passerby. Your beauty became his. You took some of your garments and made for yourself colorful shrines, and on them played the whore. You or the like has never been, nor ever shall be. You also took the beautiful jewels of my gold and my silver, which I had given you, and made for yourself images of men, and with them played the whore. And you took your embroidered garments to cover them, and set my oil and my incense before them. Also my bread that I gave you, I fed you with fine flour and oil and honey. You set them before them for a pleasing aroma, and so it was declared the Lord God.
So that's pretty explicit. When that comes up on your family reading plan, when you're reading the Bible with your kids, what do you say? I mean, this is God talking to his people. Why is he describing it in such graphic terms? You think?
We gotta make it hit.
Yeah. Just gotta open our eyes like, wow.
That this is what you're doing. We don't think about our worship of God, our spirituality on the level of marriage, but that's what God keeps saying in the prophets. Oh, we've seen this in just about every single one of them. Pretty explicit, graphic. Like any guy that comes by, you'll jump his bones. That's what God's saying to his people. And I gave you everything. What did I not give you? I mean, if you think about it on the level of a husband to a wife, I've sacrificed for you. Everything that you had was mine. I was gonna serve you. I was gonna be there for you, protect you, provide for you. And you spit in the face of all of that, and you stood up by the street waiting for any other man to come by, and you'd be fine with that.
In the CSB, in the end of verse 19, he says, that is what happened.
That's a good translation.
This is the declaration of the Lord. Like, it's
Yeah.
like, that is what happened. Like,
Yeah.
don't even try and argue. Like, I like the way
That is a good, I like that.
It's like,
It's what happened. Like this is what you did. And and God told them what would happen if you did this. He told them through Moses that you would go to exile if you were unfaithful. Let me just read you a cross-reference. Y'all can write down Deuteronomy 28, 63 through 64. Remember, the end of Deuteronomy, at the end of the Pentateuch, comes all the promises of blessing and cursing. Like you could either be cursed or blessed, and this is what's going to happen to get you cursed. This is what's going to happen to get you blessed. And he says in verse 63, as the Lord took delight in doing you good and multiplying you, so the Lord will take delight in bringing ruin upon you and destroying you. Do you see that? I'm going to take delight in bringing ruin and destruction upon you if you don't obey me in the land. And you shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. God promised his people centuries earlier that this is what happened. In verse 64, and the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. You're just going to be making up nonsense and be taken out in that way. Deuteronomy 28, 63, 64, centuries earlier, the first big prophet Moses says that, and now we're getting towards the last of the prophets are saying, told you so. We're like God saying through these men, I told you so. God's saying, you guys have caused this separation. If this could be likened to a divorce, which I don't think is a good one-for-one comparison, God can say, I am completely innocent in this. The separation that's happened between us is utterly and totally your fault. And in chapter 24, it happens. The siege of Jerusalem happens in chapter 24, verse 2. Somebody read that.
Son of man, write down the name of this day, this very day. The king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day.
This very day. It happened today. Laid siege to Jerusalem. Ezekiel's already out, and it's utter decimation is happening this very day. It's over. Everything that you had put your trust in, that if as long as we have that temple, we're good. It's gone. As long as we have the city of David, we're good. It's gone. No more throne, no more palace, no more presence of God there. It's over. So then he shifts. So that ends the first section. With the first two visions are in the first section. Judgment coming to Jerusalem, a.k.a. Judah, the people left of God. But then he switches to judging the nations. We're going to skim that real quick. But why does God have to make it clear he's going to judge the nations? Why would that be something that would be burning in our brains after studying the whole Old Testament so far?
I think it's a way to be able to say no one's free of saying.
Right. Yeah, no, we're free. Because then you think like, well, is God the God of the Babylonians now? Because they're not good people. This kind of goes back to Habakkuk, right? Wait a minute. Like, you can't judge us with guys worse than us. That's not how it is. Like, you can't have the bad kid at school spank me when I get home. He's worse than I am. But God, I can do whatever I want, and then I can judge them for that. Nobody's going to escape this. So, and their leaders are corrupt, and he says so in 34, verse 2. But in 33 and 34, rather, before I get ahead of myself, God's going to take his people to task again. So now we're on this side of it. So God's going to judge the nations. He's sovereign over that too. But the restoration point, he still has a couple more complaints against his people, pretty explicit complaints for two major reasons. Their leaders are corrupt, and they've rejected the word of God. So somebody read chapter 33, verses 30 through 32.
As for you, son of man, your people who talk together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses say to one another, each to his brother, come and hear what the word is that comes from the Lord. And they come to you as people come, and they sit before you as my people. And they hear what you say, but they will not do it. For with lustful talk in their mouths they act, their heart is set on their gain. And behold, you are to them like one who sings lustful songs with a beautiful voice and plays well on an instrument. For they hear what you say, but they will not do it. When this comes, and come it will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them.
That last line. They will know that a prophet has been among them. Can you think of a good reference or cross-reference to the New Testament for like they hear what you say, but they will not do it.
James 1:22 maybe?
Exactly right. James 1:22 through 25. That you hearers who don't do God's word are deluding themselves. But the faithful man hears God's word and does it. But the beginning of the verse says that they're all the people that talk together and they say, hey, come and hear what the word is from God. Let's go sit and listen to preaching. Let's go get around in a Bible study. And they're like, great, close the book and never do it. And God's saying that this is one of the problems I have with you, Israel. And are we immune to that today? I mean, isn't that like consistently the problem of our own heart? That will.
It sounds like today.
It sounds exactly like today, right? And you're like, this is exactly. Hey, we're all want to go to church. I mean, people are piling into churches. I mean, if there was really as many mega churches as we have in the United States, and they were really full of that many Christians, would our country be that bad? Would it be as bad as it is? It can't be. I used to think that about when I was in college at Texas A&M. They did this thing called Breakaway, and they would fill up the basketball arena every Tuesday night. 10,000 students. And everybody would rant and rave about how amazing it was. And that is a good thing that happens on the campus. That happens, and everybody sees that. But I started thinking, I was like, you know what? If 1/4, because at that time there's about 40,000 students at A&M, if 1/4 of the student body are Christians and dedicated to this, then why is A&M, why is the Kroger on Southwest Parkway the highest seller of alcohol per capita in the United States? It's not because people are there drinking in moderation and they just have a lot of people in that town. It's a tiny town. Like, why is there not more godliness on the campus? Why is there still an abortion clinic that's in business at the time? It's not because of that. So this is what Ezekiel's saying. Like, this is what, or God's saying through Ezekiel. You're ignoring my word, but you really like the culture of stability that religion about God gives you. And God says, I'm going to take that away from you. But restoration is coming, and that's vision 3. God coming back to the temple and a promise of paradise that's going to show up. So in chapter 36, we see this massive cross-reference that we are shamefully not going to get to spend enough time in. But let me read it to you. 36, verse 24 and following. This is to write in your Bible and to connect to Jeremiah 31 through 34. Because same idea, more color on this picture. So verse 24, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries. Didn't the cursing just say, I'm going to scatter you? I'm going to gather you. I'm going to bring you all back and bring you into your own land. But then he starts talking a little broader. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleannesses. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. How are you going to do that, God? This is how, verse 26. I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. So when you see that, don't think like giving you a fleshly heart like a sinful heart. Think of it like you have a rock where your heart should be, and I'm going to give you one that beats, that's muscle. I'm going to put that in you. And verse 27 is a big deal. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. Isn't that the big problem with the Old Testament law? We can't obey God's rules. But I bet we could if God's Spirit was inside of us in a way that he wasn't before. So this is big time New Testament language that this promise is massive for us. And he illustrates it in chapter 37, which again we don't have time to read, but I would encourage you to go home and read, is the valley of dry bones coming to life. That God takes Ezekiel out to this valley, and there's just nothing but just dead bone. Not just like people who are on their last leg. It's not a vision of those who just all had cardiac arrest and they're all laying down next to each other. This is people who have been long dead. There's not even any meat left on these bones. And then God shows Ezekiel, hey, preach the word to them. And what happens? They all come alive. Flesh appears on the bones. They all stand up. And it's like this, and it's a vision like an army. And aren't we called the army of the Lord? Onward, Christian soldiers. Not about the Crusades, about the Christian life. So this is New Testament stuff right here. That I'm going to make you alive because you're spiritually dead. You're not just on your last leg. You're not just sick. He doesn't take them to the hospital room to go and see, like, wow, these people are sick. Give them the antidote. No, he goes, I'm going to show you people who are dead. You can't even see their faces. They're so dead. And make them come alive. That's what God does to all of us. So he does that. This is the coming vision of this paradise kind of coming. But the last series of visions comes in 40 through 48 when he lets him see a new temple. And chapter 40, verse 4, can serve as a sort of climax for the whole book. Somebody read that. Or beginning of it.
And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and set your heart upon all that I shall show you. For you were brought here in order that I might show it to you. Declare all that you see to the house of Israel.
So they're like, the readers, the listeners would be enthralled, would be captivated. Wait, this is all going to happen? And the vision, the last series of visions hasn't even started yet. But he's going to rebuild the temple, a vision of it in chapter 43. So the God leaves the temple in this one, 10 and 11, and he's going to come back in 43. A future return. So look at 43, 1 through 5. Let me read that.
Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel, was coming from the way of the east. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. And the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house.
It's just amazing. He said, it's just like the vision, the glorious vision that I saw the first time I was by the Chebar Canal, the Chebar River. But that one was sad and miserable because God was leaving the temple. But now he comes back. His presence returns. But then he does something interesting in that. When he falls on his face, right response, by the way, just like Isaiah, just like Peter in the boat, just like everybody who sees the glory of God. And when he comes in, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. He shouldn't have been allowed to do that. What gets torn when Jesus dies on the cross? The veil dividing the inner court from the outer court. You can go in there now. Because God has said, come in to all who will. So this just highlights the restoration that's coming. This highlights what is going to be true of God's people. That there is going to be a fully restored relationship with his people. And it kind of ends that way, the book. It ends in a really kind of poetic way. The last verse of the last chapter, 48:35. After he's describing the city, and he says, and the name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. That is an awesome name for a city. The Lord is there. You can't say that about any other city, but the eternal city. So this really does function kind of like the revelation of the Old Testament. What is coming in that great and glorious day of the Lord? These promises that there's no record of when the exiles under Ezekiel's day, when they start coming back with Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, they leave in 3 waves, they come back in 3 waves, and they rebuild the temple first thing, but there's no record of God's glory filling it again, like it did with Solomon. Remember that moment when Solomon builds the temple in 2 Kings, and the glory of God comes roaring in there, and it just scares everybody to death, and it's this great and glorious moment? That doesn't happen again. So we're looking towards a future day, a glorious future day, a land we still look forward to. So God offers this renewed hope to his people, and he can do that, and they can hope because of chapter 36. I mean, chapter 36 is the linchpin that you can hope for this, that you can think through this, because you've been made new. God, my Spirit dwells in you. I'm going to cause you to obey, not just command that you obey. That's what he does for us. Whenever we're obeying God's word, can we say, like, yeah, man, I was just so faithful today. I was just laboring for the Lord, and I kind of crushed it. Like, man, by grace of God. When anybody tells you, like, man, you're a really great father, how do you do that? Well, let me show you the book that I wrote on how to be like. No, you just go, but by the grace of God. Like, man, you really handled that situation really well at work when your boss was chewing you out. Like, how'd you do that? Well, I just disciplined myself to be really godly. No, you say by the grace of God. I wanted to kill him, but I didn't, and that was the Lord's grace to me. He's causing me to obey. I can't take credit for that. So Ezekiel brings that up to us. And he says he's going to atone for their sin in 1663, so that the sin is really going to be paid for. I'm not just going to not look at it. So kind of an awesome thing. The way we got to wrap up here, 6 minutes. But the last comparison I wanted to make is like approaching the New Testament. Ezekiel to John, which just by providential happenstance, we're preaching through John. But John seems to really latch on to Ezekiel, and then God uses him to write the New Testament companion to Ezekiel. Because Jesus as the glory of God in the temple, because one of the main themes of Ezekiel is the glory of God and the temple of God, if not the main theme. And so then John talks about, in John 1:14, that he says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. We talked about that a few Sundays ago. And what does Ezekiel say? He sees God's glory. In those visions, I wrote down a bunch of references that say the glory of God. But the first vision and the last vision, what is he in 1 through 3 and 48, well, really chapter 43, he says, I saw God's glory. So John's saying, we saw it too, but it was in Jesus. And then Jesus as being the temple, that Jesus says in chapter 2 in John, which we haven't gotten to, well, we just did. Yeah, we're there. We're just not to those verses yet. When he cleans the temple out the first time, and he says, this temple will be destroyed and I will build it up again in 3 days. And then they're like, what do you mean? You can't do that. It took years to build this thing. You're going to build it up in 3 days? And then John goes on to say, but they did not know that Jesus was talking about his own body as the temple where the glory of God dwells. And then you have this other moment when the woman at the well, he's talking about life-giving water springing up from him to whoever will drink it. Life-giving water from Jesus, who calls himself the temple. And then Ezekiel has this other vision that we didn't get to look at. But in life-giving water 47, towards the end of the book, 47, 2 through 12, the temple has water coming out of it. And then God takes Ezekiel further and further into the water. He's like, it was ankle deep, then it was knee deep, then it was waist deep. And this water is coming out in a desert place, bringing life-giving water coming from the temple. Just like Jesus said, chapter 2, I am the temple. Chapter 4, water that gives life comes from me. And then the last one, a little more of the obvious ones, is that we talked about why God's going to judge Judah. One of the reasons is they have bad under-shepherds, that their leaders are poor. And God calls them shepherds that are greedy for selfish gain, that they eat the sheep instead of feeding the sheep. In 34, he talks about them explicitly. And then Jesus, he calls himself the good shepherd. And the only gospel writer to record that is John. And then John, we didn't even get to talk about the connections that God makes with Ezekiel and John in Revelation, because John writes Revelation also. This is just the Gospel of John. We wouldn't have time to do all the craziness that Revelation connects with. But just to show, I always like to show continuity in the Bible when we see it, because it's helpful when we're reading about wheels spinning with eyes all over them to know, hey, this matters. This connects. Any questions or thoughts about Ezekiel? All right.